So these last few weeks, we've been talking about ethical decision-making, and I think it's such an important subject, especially with everything that's going on. The world just seems to be serving up so many ethical dilemmas. I mean, real, legitimate dilemmas, where there isn't a clear side to take. There isn't a clear right or wrong. I mean, these really are dilemmas, and you can see, pros and cons on both sides. How do we go about making these choices that we need to make in life? And we do need to make choices in life, if not because we're making policy or doing any specific action, just so that we can navigate our way through. To know where our North Star is. How do we feel about certain things? How do we then do whatever it is that we do, if it's just voting or whatever it happens to be? How do we make these decisions? And we talked about the fact that there are three basic families of ethical theory out there. And so the question becomes, when you're making an ethical decision, do you primarily look at the consequences of your decision? Do you look at what is going to happen? And if you're a utilitarian, then are you looking at, will your decision create the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people for the longest amount of time? Is that the way you're looking at your decisions? Or are you looking before the decision and saying, there are absolute rules, there are laws, there are moral duties that have been given to us, either by the state, by God, by Scripture, law, whatever. But those duties, those laws, those rules need to be followed, regardless of the circumstances they create. Two very different ways of looking at making ethical decisions. And then the third family is called virtue ethics, and it's looking at ideal human character to be our guide. What is this ideal character? Is someone that you've known from your past, someone that you know now, someone from history? Obviously, for us as Christians, it's going to be Jesus. And the idea is, if you look at this person who has this ideal mix of qualities, wisdom and humility and beneficence and non-maleficence and so on and so forth, what would that person do? How would that person choose? That becomes your guide for making your choices. And so literally, right, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Now, if you look at Jesus, he really is a balance of all of these. He uses the rules and he uses law. He follows the law, at least the written law. He likes to play with the oral law. But the written law he follows. There is no instance in Scripture showing us that Jesus broke the written rule. But he uses that rule as a guide. He uses it as instruction, which is really what Torah means. Torah doesn't mean law the way we think of law, or namasah in Aramaic. Doesn't mean the kind of juggernaut, absolute, monolithic rule that we think of when we think of law. It's an instruction. It's a guide. It's a hand at the small of your back guiding you through. He uses the law that way, as an instruction and as a guide, but always subordinate to the mercy and the compassion that is required in any given moment. If you bring yourself, as Jesus did, completely present to a moment where you can see what is going on, you can see the people in it, you can see what is needed, what does love require in that moment? Now, the law is a guide, of course, but we need to be present and make the decision. We can't just abdicate our decisions to law. At least that's not what we see Jesus doing. And Jesus brings common sense to every decision he makes. Not just mercy and compassion, but absolute common sense. All of those Sabbath healings that he did to get in trouble with the Pharisees, right? It wasn't just to stick a finger in their eye. It was to make a point, right? Why would he heal on the Sabbath? Because what was the Sabbath's intent? The Sabbath's intent was to create a day where we could remind ourselves of God's presence in our lives. After a hectic work week where everything is happening all at once, you get to the Sabbath. Now you have this time where we can really bring God's presence back into our lives. And we can bring some refreshment. We can bring some refilling of ourselves, an infilling of the Spirit so that we can start the week again. What creates more healing than actually healing on the Sabbath? What creates more refreshment? What creates more awareness of God's presence than healing on the Sabbath? And interestingly, if Jesus just healed with the word, that actually doesn't break any of the oral commandments of the Pharisees. But as soon as he told the person he healed to pick up their pallet and walk, that was breaking an oral commandment. As soon as he mixed saliva and dirt in his palm, he was kneading to put on the eyes of the blind man. Now he broke an oral commandment. But let's think about it commonsensically. Did that really obstruct the intent of the Sabbath law? You see what Jesus is doing? He's using the law as the guide. He's fulfilling the intent of the law, but he's doing it in a way that sometimes is going to break the letter, at least of certain parts of the law. And so what does love require in the moment? That's what Jesus is trying to get at. And he's trying to show us, how are we going to make our decisions? We can bring all these together. We can use the rules, but we also need to look at the consequences. And we need to bring ourselves into the moment as presently as possible. Now, the law itself is a really blunt instrument. Yeah? I mean, that's what it's sort of designed to be. It is trying to hit the widest target and have the broadest positive effect within a group. That's its purpose. That's what it's trying to do. So it can't always take into account the needs and the circumstances of any given moment and the people who are in that moment. We need people to do that. The law can't do that because the law isn't there and the law is blind, right? The law is what the law is, but people in the moment using the law as guide can now see what is really required here. Zero tolerance laws just always get my goat. They just never seem to work. You know, there's a time back when schools trying to keep the kids safe, good intention, right? They had a zero tolerance policy for knives. Nobody could bring a knife in. And so inevitably, here's the situation of a little kid getting expelled from school because he brought a little plastic knife to spread peanut butter on his sandwich. We need people in place who can use the law as the guide. What is the law's purpose? To keep the kids safe. Obviously, this is not a threat. But we need people to be able to interpret that, people to be able to bring their common sense, their mercy, and their compassion into each moment so that everything actually works. The law is about safety for the people. The law is about preserving the rights of the people. And it's also about justice, of course. It's about justice. And so I suppose if we're really going to look at how Jesus would make his choices so that we can make ours accordingly, how does Jesus relate to justice itself? A few years ago, and it's getting to be a lot of years ago, how many of you have done a prison visit before or a jail visit? A few of you? Okay, yeah. Man, when you step into the jail or the prison, it's entering another world, isn't it? I mean, you just feel it when you walk in the door and the door's closed behind you. You're in a different world. And all these humorless guards just walking around. You go up to the window and you give them your ID and you sign in. And they give you a couple of numbers, a number of a door and a number of a window. And then you go into this waiting area and you just sit there. And this waiting area, at least at the Men's Central Jail in Santa Ana, where I was last, huge room, huge waiting area. And everything is bolted down. The tables and the chairs are all bolted to the floor. And you're looking at a wall on the far side that just has a series of doors with numbers over them. And you're just waiting for your number to be called. And it's, you know, you've kind of, what is that line from Secret Agent Man, giving you a number, taking away your name? You kind of feel that way. You're not a name anymore. You're just a number. And you're waiting for your number to be called. And when the number is called, the door opens and you walk in and you're presented with this long hallway. And on either side is just banks of windows on either side and bolted down stools in front of each window and these low dividers between them. It doesn't give you any privacy. I don't even know why they bother, but it does come up to maybe about this high so you can see over the dividers. And on the other side of the glass, of course, opens to the jail side, and that's where all the inmates come in. And then you sit at your assigned window and you wait again, and you wait, and you wait. It's like time doesn't matter in the jail. You know, it's all very arbitrary. I think I waited about 45 minutes sitting at that on the stool in front of the window for the person that I was supposed to see. And so I'm just kind of taking it all in as I'm there. You know, it was really unexpected to me. I don't know what you would think of as the demeanor of the people visiting someone in jail. You probably think of them as kind of mournful and kind of sad. You know, it was anything but that. There was a celebratory air, in the people, in their energy and the way that they were moving around in the space and the way that they were talking to their loved one as the prison visit was going on. And there's all sorts of people, all different types of people. There was young women all dolled up and dressed up and made up, and there was parents, obviously, grandparents, older people. There was this one large Hispanic man who was obviously a pastor or some kind of minister. And he was very loudly encouraging and counseling and doing his thing and flipping back and forth between English and Spanish. And so I'm just watching this, and I'm kind of amazed at, this is just families getting together with other family members. And there was two girls that were sitting in the same stool next to me, and they were chattering away with the person and flipping again between English and Spanish. And I turned my stool around to look at the other bank of windows, and a window down on the far side, there was a girl there talking to a young man in his orange jumpsuit on the other side of the glass. And she was leaned in, and she was so earnest. And even from the angle that I was seeing, I can see her eyes, the softness of her eyes. She could have been sitting across a white tablecloth draped candlelit dinner, the way that she was looking at the young man on the other side of that glass. There was no sense of offense with her. All it was with her was her and the man that she loved. And it really struck me to see that, to see the look in her eyes, to see how there was nothing that was separating her from him at that moment except this glass. It reminded me of the prodigal son in an orange jumpsuit, all the offenses just completely wiped out. Just the sheer exuberance of the father greeting his son no matter what he had done. And so what about justice in this case? What about fairness in this case? What about the victims of whatever crime he committed? And I have no idea what crime he committed. But what about them? Is all that just to be wiped out in this loving look through the glass? What about the elder brother of the prodigal son himself? What about that? What about his pain? What about his anger? What about fairness to him? What about justice for him? Where does all that go in this overarching love of the father, or the overarching love of a young girlfriend? You see, Jesus and God and the girl are orange colorblind. They don't see orange. They don't see the offense. They don't see the jumpsuit. They don't appear to see any faults at all. Everything appears to be washed away in love. And that's not fair, is it? God's love is not fair. It's absolutely and deliberately unjust if you want to think about God's love. So what about justice? God is supposed to be just, right? And the church emphasizes justice and obedience and law all the time. In fact, I was taught that at the end of my life, when I am face to face with the Lord's fierce holiness would absolutely burn anything to ash that wasn't completely perfect. Any imperfections would just be burned away to ash. And that's why we needed to be obedient. That's why we needed to follow the law. That's why we needed the blood of Jesus over us, because God's love was such, or God's justice was such. And so I remember thinking as I was hearing that, it sounds to me like God is a slave to his own justice. God is a slave to his own law, that he can't do anything in the moment that mercy and compassion may require, because his holiness is such. And that didn't sit real well with me. And especially as I began more and more to study Jesus in the Gospels, I'm seeing that Jesus is showing us a very different kind of love. He's showing us a God who loves right through any imperfection, loves right through the law. How can God do this? How can God love like this and still be just at the same time? This is where it gets into two different contexts that we live in life simultaneously. And I don't know why we don't hear more about this. because the misuse of these two contexts, or just not being aware of them, causes so much confusion in our culture, in our society, in our churches. And this is simply the micro and the macro. And I know we've talked about this in before, but to bring it again, hopefully to a finer point, we as human beings have all our moments really in the micro. We're only talking usually to one person at a time, or even now as I'm talking to a group, I can only still look at one of you at a time. Our life day to day and moment by moment is lived conversation by conversation, person by person in the micro. And yet at the same time, we're part of a group. We're part of a society. We're part of a nation. We're part of a tribe, the whole world. And so we live these two contexts together. And yet the primary one that we really are experiencing is micro. Love looks different in these two different contexts. In the macro, love looks like justice, but in the micro, love looks like mercy and compassion. And it's so important for us to get these two. Justice must rule in the macro to sustain the cohesion of the group. If you don't have laws, if you don't have order, if you don't have a way to make things equal for people, then the group falls apart. Law is the most important thing to point to in the macro, in the group. But God never relates to us, each one of us, in the macro. God relates to us in the micro, one-on-one. And so mercy and compassion take the fore. I want to read a few paragraphs from The Fifth Way. See if we can lock this in. Compassion is not just, and justice is not compassionate, nor should they be. If you think of justice as getting what you deserve, either positively or negatively, then mercy is not getting what you negatively deserve. And compassion could be considered giving what is not positively deserved, or at least earned. Mercy and compassion do not right any wrongs. They deliberately unbalance the scales of justice. They are unashamedly unfair in order to favor the object of affection. Justice, in order to be completely fair, must willfully ignore and suppress any feelings of affection or desire for mercy that may arise. Like a judge who must follow the letter of the law, even if it keeps her tossing and turning all night long. But though mercy and justice seem diametrically opposed and separate in this way, at root, they are both manifestations of the same reign of unity, of God's love. And both are critical aspects of ethical decision-making. Knowing the difference between the two and when and where each must take precedence for the greatest good, for shalom, are critical to making choices that create and preserve kingdom. One of the reasons this has been so difficult for us to reconcile and understand is that we seem to have forgotten something that Yeshua understood very well. That we live our lives on two levels simultaneously, the micro and the macro. The micro dealing with the smallest number of things, and the macro, the largest quantities of things, describe our lives as individuals relating to other individuals in the micro, and at the same time to all the others in our community and society at once in the macro. There is a difference between the way we relate to a solitary person who is right in front of us and the way we relate to the entire population of any group. Our family, our church, our company, our city, state, nation, world. Not to see that this is so is to treat individuals and to try to treat individuals in the same way we treat a group or vice versa does a great harm to both. In the macro, compassion is not enough. Justice must prevail, must be prized and sought beyond compassion and mercy in order for the group to survive. But in the micro, justice is not enough. Face to face and person to person, compassion and mercy must prevail and be sought above justice in order for kingdom to exist at all. Since people don't and won't always act in a loving way, to maintain order, the basic mode of operation in the macro for the common good is justice, righting wrongs and making things equal. There must be a power in the macro, strong enough to arbitrate disputes, judge and punish offenders, and force all parties into submission. But the message of Yeshua in all Scripture is that in the micro, balancing scales and giving only what is deserved or earned could never describe the love that God desires us to have for one another. As Yeshua said at Matthew 5, "For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others?" Bright lines need to be drawn here. A group cannot be compassionate without being unjust. And an individual cannot merely be just to another individual without being unmerciful and uncompassionate. And remember, the group doesn't have to be big. It just has to be more than two. Those of you who have ever watched children or had a third child, you know that third child changes the dynamic completely, right? That third child, because now everything is about justice. Everything has to be fair, right? That dynamic is so huge, and yet we don't really consider it in our ethical decision making. And if you think about it, church is a macro institution. It must have rules, and it must have a means of enforcing those rules. But God only has one rule: unity, oneness, the connection of everything. And that looks like love, looks like mercy in the micro, but it also looks like justice in the macro. The unity of the group depends on justice. The unity of the one-on-one relationship depends upon mercy and compassion. And that's what we all want, right? To be loved, to be accepted, while we're still wearing our orange jumpsuit, while we're still being punished in the macro. Don't we still want to know that we're loved and accepted? We want someone looking at us the way that girl was looking at her boyfriend across the glass in the orange jumpsuit. Well, guess what? Someone does look at us that way. And that's what Jesus is trying to show us. These two contexts operate simultaneously, but there's mercy also always within the justice. Take a look at Matthew 5:20. It's that signature verse that we looked at last week as well. "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." When I finally got this, I mean, it just rocketed through me. It so changed my understanding of what this was all about. That's why it became the passcode for everything a few years back, because I just wanted to keep reinforcing it. And yet when you read it, it's not a very sexy or interesting verse. It doesn't sound that way. Unless your righteousness exceeds and surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. But what is this righteousness that Jesus is talking about? The righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees was the righteousness of the law, the righteousness of obedience, the righteousness of legalism. That if we followed everything perfectly and missed absolutely nothing, then we were righteous. Then we were recognized by God. Then we were recognized by the others around us. And then we could lord it over those who were Am Haaretz, those who were people of the land, they call them, people who stood outside the law, who didn't follow the law the way we follow the law. But what's the righteousness of God? Of course, mercy, compassion. It's a micro righteousness. The righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees is a macro righteousness. Now, while we still recognize the need for law and order in the macro, what we're saying here is it's not the final word. That's what Jesus is trying to get across to us. It's not our motivation for the ethical decisions that we need to make. And so in the midst of all the macro realities around us, we can still keep our hearts fixed on micro-human need as we move through the moments of our lives. To pick up one of the huge issues of today, immigration. How does that apply? Can you advocate for strong borders and strong immigration law and at the same time care deeply about each individual immigrant and want them treated humanely and want them to have the ability to raise their families with dignity and the kind of affluence that we all deserve as human beings? Is that inconsistent to say? See, absolutely not. Because one is macro and the other is micro. If a country is going to survive, it needs to have laws. It needs to have the majority of the people following the laws so that the group knows where they stand and the group can live their lives. But if we go so far to the side of justice that we no longer have any mercy and compassion for people who are trying to better their families and trying to survive, then we've lost our way. It is consistent if we can code shift between the two contexts here and realize that love looks like justice here and love looks like mercy and compassion here, and that we, paradoxically, as human beings, are always oscillating between the two because they're both simultaneous in our lives. When we can find that balance, then we can begin to see life through God's eyes, which is what Jesus is trying to do for us. Help us to see life as God sees it, which is what he calls kingdom. Now, I paraphrase from an Aramaic point of view, Matthew 5:20, and it's in the handouts if you want to follow along. Something like this: when your deepest desire within becomes one and the same with God's deepest desire, when you value others as much as yourself, when you see God in every breath, face, and movement and moment, you will be fulfilling the purpose of the law and not just following rules. You will be in the kingdom of heaven by definition and not an instant before. This is what Jesus is trying to say to us, trying to get us to understand. We have to exceed the law, exceed justice, exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, all the way to the love and the mercy of God's compassion. And we're only going to be able to experience or even believe conceptually in God's love when we're actually practicing it. That's the only way that it's going to come across. You have to experience this love coming from you to someone who's still in their orange jumpsuit in order to realize that that love is coming to you and flowing through you while you're still in your orange jumpsuit. And we're not going to be able to practice this love until we stop merely following rules or thinking that that's all we need to do in this equation to God's approval and quote-unquote salvation. And to realize that even sometimes we're going to have to break some rules in order to be able to provide the mercy and compassion and what love requires. Remember that great story? It's at Matthew 26, verse 11. And this is where Jesus is visiting Lazarus and Mary and Martha. And they're a famous family, brothers and sisters. Lazarus, as you recall, is the one that Jesus rose from the dead. Mary and Martha are the ones that are the administrative and the dreamer, the two that are constantly kind of at odds with each other. When he was there for dinner one night, and Martha was running around trying to do all the table setting and all the preparation, and Mary was dreamily sitting at Jesus' feet, and Martha complains. That's Mary and Martha that we're talking about here. So he's over there another time. And what does Martha do? True to her character, she comes out with a jar of perfume, very expensive perfume, and she breaks it open and she pours it all over Jesus' feet as he's reclining at the table. And Judas is immediately incensed. Oh, how could she do this? Do you know how much that cost? We could have taken that money and given it to the poor. Now, what does Jesus do? He looks at him and says, you're always going to have the poor with you, Judas, but you're not always going to have me. What did Jesus just do there? He switched the context from macro to micro, right? Mary comes to him, complete one-on-one devotion, just completely immersed in the moment, and does this act. She probably wasn't even thinking about any of it. She just does it because it's the way that she could just try to express what she was feeling inside. Micro moment. Judas comes at her and criticizes her from a macro position. We could have given this to the poor out there someplace, across the street, across the city, across the world. And Jesus brings him right back to micro. You're always going to have the poor. Those systems out there that you're trying to fix, they're always going to be in place. The world works the way the world does, and that's probably for a reason. Don't let the macro be an excuse for not doing in the micro what our heart is really leading us to be able to do. The macro should never be an excuse not to do what we do in the micro. When I was working for the Children of the Americas, the nonprofit that was working in Mexico, I remember early on how hard it was for me to go down to Mexico, spend a day there, work with a few dozen kids and families, knowing that that day 50,000 kids died worldwide of vaccine-preventable disease and malnutrition. I couldn't square that. What's the purpose? What's the point? Why should I go down and just work with a few when this statistic was banging in my head? If you're going to work for any amount of time in nonprofit work and humanitarian work, you got to cross that hurdle. You got to get to the other side of the statistics. You got to get to the other side of the macro. You got to get right back down to the micro, and it becomes starfish on the beach, right? The little kid throwing the starfish back that are beached on the dry sand. How does it matter? Is it drop in the bucket? Well, it matters to this starfish. That's it. When we can take our concepts and bring them back into the micro, suddenly meaning and purpose is imbued back into what we're doing, into our lives. And this is what Jesus is trying to get us to understand. Jesus is always teaching from within the micro, within compassion, within the context of kingdom and micro relationship. Now, God's law is only fulfilled in micro, in compassion. Yes, it's a macro instrument. It was their civil law as well as their religious law, but it was only and ever fulfilled in the micro, with people's hearts involved. Never by just mere rule following or the justice of the macro. Exceeding the righteousness of the Pharisees is moving beyond the macro, moving beyond the law, coming right back to the micro again. And Jesus is illustrating how this works all through chapter 5 of the Sermon on the Mount. Those 6 antitheses that we talked about and have talked about from time to time. Jesus tackles some of the most thorny issues of his people at the time. There's murder, there's adultery, there's divorce and remarriage, there's retribution, there's oath-taking, and finally the loving of the enemy. Those 6 that he's working through, he's showing them this dichotomy between micro and macro, how we move through this. And as you watch and see Jesus teaching on this, you see how he is talking about these issues. Remember, you've heard it of old said, don't murder. But I'm telling you, even if you have an angry thought, then you've already are guilty. He's saying, yeah, in the macro, it looks like you're just, it looks like you're righteous, but it's the interior. And as we look at those, we see that 3 basic principles are emerging here that change everything in terms of our spirituality and in terms of our ethical application. Going from macro back to micro, from law back to relationship, from fear of punishment to love. And I wanted to go through those principles with you. Again, they're in the handout if you want to follow along. The first one, keeping the law, right, means fulfilling the purpose of the law, not just following rules. So important for us to understand that. Keeping the law means fulfilling the purpose, not just following the code, not just following the rules. Take a look. Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the man or woman which can defile him if it goes into him. But the things which proceed out of the man are what defile the man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. When he had left the crowd and entered the house, the disciples questioned him about the parable. And he said to them, are you so lacking in understanding also? Do you not understand that whatever goes into the man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach and is eliminated? And thus he declared all foods clean. Do you know what a mind-blowing moment this would have meant for them, would have been? My gosh, they lived kosher. They lived by the dietary code and the puritary codes. And if you think about why those codes were there in the first place, well, if you go all the way back, maybe they knew that there was something toxic about pork and shellfish, that if you didn't, what's the word? Prepare it just right, a lot of bad things happen. Maybe that was part of the idea. Again, preserving the integrity of the group, the health of the group. Also, to try to keep the people of Israel when they left Egypt from being assimilated into all the other cultures around them, so that they didn't eat the way the others ate. And that kept them apart. That was something that was daily. It was something right in their face all the whatever the reasons were for the dietary codes, they had a purpose. But that isn't what made the people righteous. Jesus is saying right now, it doesn't matter the foods you eat to God's love. I mean, really, common sense. Let's think about this. But can you imagine just someone who's not been able to eat pork his whole life, just like those poor Catholics who couldn't eat meat on Friday, and then suddenly, in the mid-60s, hey, ollie ollie and free. It's hard. It's a mind-blowing concept. But Jesus is making this strong point here. Keeping the law means fulfilling the purpose of the law, not merely following rules. Second, obedience and disobedience are inward, not outward functions. They are matters of the heart. So important for us to understand this. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, if you're going to take that literally, men, it's going to be a tough road to hoe, right? I remember a Christian pastor on the radio saying, I don't know how men can even watch commercials on TV because they're violating this commandment. It's like, oh, come on. Jesus has a lot more common sense than that. But the point he's making is so well taken. If we take it out of the literal and realize he's not creating another law here, he's trying to get a point across. Obedience and disobedience has to do with an inward function. I love to tell this story about the daughter who always stood up during dinner at the table. And the father says, sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down. Finally, she sits down. And then she glares across the table and says, I may be sitting down on the outside, but on the inside, I'm standing up. It's an inward function. You can conform, but it doesn't have anything to do with the state of your heart. We're supposed to transform, not conform. And this is what Jesus is trying to get across. It has to do with what's going on inside. Just because you haven't committed adultery, just because you haven't murdered somebody, doesn't mean that the state of your relationships are good. The state of your marriage is good. That comes from the inside out. And we have to understand this. We can't be so legalistic, so just geared toward rule after rule and following them to perfection that we lose sight of what's really supposed to be happening here. And the third one, outward forms and rituals mean nothing if the heart is not right. We talk about this every time we have a sacrament in here, whether it's baptism or whatever. And we say a sacrament is an outward expression of an inward transformation. There is nothing in the ritual that is magical. That would be superstition if we thought this ritual did something for us spiritually. But when we bring a transformed heart to the ritual, then it's this beautiful expression in which the group, the macro, can now share and partake and celebrate. So important for holding the group together. Jesus says, this is Hosea, for I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Love that verse. It also is echoed at Matthew 9:13 and 12:7. It's not about the burnt offerings. It's not about all of that. I desired mercy and not sacrifice, and knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. And then in Micah 6, does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams, in 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? The Lord has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. And finally from Matthew 5. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Doesn't matter how many birds you kill or what you burn at the altar if the heart is not right. And so all of our macro tools, justice, law, obedience, conformance, ritual, doctrine, all those things can't and won't move us into kingdom. They can't transform us at all into kingdom. They can't make us into a reflection of God's love. All of those macro tools. And so, like the elder brother of the prodigal, we must go past our addiction to fairness and justice and rules and laws and some sort of equation that will, at arm's length, get us into God's good graces. If we want to go to the party, we're going to have to get past all of that. And that's what Jesus is trying to get across to us. That prisoner's colorblind girlfriend understood all of this, not in a conscious way. She just moved past it because of what she was feeling. And if you think about it, she was probably criticized for it, right? I'm sure people called her codependent, called her a fool, called her enabler, called her a doormat, all these things. And maybe she was. Maybe there was not a real healthy relationship there. But I'll tell you what, I'd give anything for my wife to look at me that way when I didn't deserve it. When I was still being punished. When I was still wearing my orange jumpsuit. On the other side of that glass, that's the look that I want. And to know through Jesus that that's exactly how God looks at me changes everything. Changes my view of life, and it will change all of our view of life. That's why Jesus made it his job as the minister, as the teacher he was, to try to get this one thing across to us. Can we just get this much? We can't approach or conceive of God's love through the law, through justice. It's not made of the same stuff. We're going to need to take a quantum leap. We're trying to sneak up and edge up and rule by rule get to where we want to go, but we're going to have to take that quantum leap. You know, when they look at those subatomic particles and there's one, and then it just kind of winks out of existence, and then it pops in over here and nobody knows why or where it went and you can't pinpoint it. We're going to have to finally make that leap into the abyss. We're going to have to take a chance, take a risk. Love in a way that has nothing to do with justice or fairness or anything that we think we can control. How do we make a leap like that? What do we do? For me, the first thing that you have to do is you have to face the outrage of the elder brother of the prodigal. And you have to face that outrage head on and admit that he's right legally. And he's miserable. And then you need to look at the father and admit that the father was wrong legally. And he's beautifully joyful at the same time. We have to see those two. And then we have to decide what it is we really want out of life. Do we want to be miserably right or joyfully wrong? The choice is ours. And secondly, we have to realize that happiness, shalom, which is the greatest amount of peace and wellness and wholeness that we can have, and kingdom itself are only possible in the injustice and the unfairness of the micro, in that love that God has for us. And so falling into this embrace that we'll never deserve, but will also never be denied, changes the balance point of our ethical choices. We can start to see rules as the broad macro guides that they are, but always superseded in each micro moment by the needs of the love of the people that share that moment with us. And when we can finally do that, when we can stop thinking about what is right and wrong as much as what love requires, with all of that law and guidance assimilated, written on our hearts, then we can begin to live like Jesus and choose the way he chose. Let's pray. Father, this makes so much common sense. And yet it is so difficult for us to get our arms around, as always. Help us more and more to see that even though we have rules and laws that we need to follow, that is not the definition of righteousness. That does nothing for our acceptability. We already have that. It does nothing for our salvation. We already have that as much as we want it. It does nothing for forgiveness. We're already forgiven as we want to be. In you, in your embrace, everything changes, and that's what we want to experience, Father. So again, help us to take the steps that we need to take, to be willing to let go of the things that we need to let go of, to be aware and intentional enough to see where our limitations and our blockages are so that we can continue to chip away at those, so we can get to where you are and just live our lives with that kind of joy and connection. Father, thank you. Thank you for being the way that you are, loving us the way that you do so that we can scamper after. Never let us forget we can only do this because you did it first. In Jesus' name. Amen. Let's all stand.